What surprises most people isn't the brutal cold of winter, it's how two worlds, modern and medieval, react in completely opposite ways the moment temperatures drop into the danger zone. In a modern house, all it takes is one heavy blizzard to knock out the power grid, and the warmth disappears almost instantly. Within 2 hours, you can see your own breath hanging white in the living room, the pipes begin to freeze, and the sound of children shivering under thin blankets brings a rising panic no smart device can solve. But for a medieval peasant, that same moment wasn't a disaster. It was just another winter night, because they lived in homes designed not for comfort, but for survival places where every material, earth, straw, wood, wool, animal fat locked together like components of a survival machine their ancestors had refined through centuries of trial and error. The irony is harsh. We have technology, but they had knowledge.
The winter has been long.
We trust electrical systems, while they relied on something far more durable, understanding nature and using it to defend themselves. And when you look at the gap between those two worlds, the real question isn't how did they survive, but would we still know how to survive if the system we depend on suddenly stopped working? When winter freezes the ground and turns the entire field into a vast sheet of gray stone, the first problem any medieval family faced wasn't the cold, it was the slow, creeping hunger. Because from late autumn until early spring, the earth offered nothing to pick, dig, or hunt. And in that brutal reality, they created what we today would probably call a permanent reserve, a food preservation system designed not with scientific theory, but with razor-sharp survival instinct. They knew bacteria needed water to live, so they hung thin slices of meat, cut fruits, and bundles of greens near the roof, where the drifting warmth from the hearth rose upward and pulled moisture out of every strip of pork and every wedge of apple. They knew salt absorbed water, so they used the precise 20-25% ratio to turn an entire pig into a protein lifeline that would last 3 months. They understood that when cabbage was mixed with salt and pressed down, oxygen disappeared and beneficial bacteria took over, transforming a fragile vegetable into a fermented, acidic, nutrient-rich shield. And when all of that still wasn't enough, they dug root cellars deep beneath the frozen soil, where the steady 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit kept turnips, potatoes, and carrots fresh for months on end. In an era where a single day of supply chain disruption is enough to send a city into panic, the way they preserved their harvest wasn't a trick, it was a true blueprint for survival. What shocks most modern people when they look deeply into medieval winter life isn't the food preservation tricks or the way they used wool, straw, and ash to stay warm. It's the almost cold, mathematical precision with which they planned calories for an entire family during 4 months of frozen earth. Because while we live with the idea of eat when you're hungry, medieval people approach food like a life or death equation, knowing that a single mistake, a sack of turnips rotting too early, a batch of meat not dried enough, could drain their strength long before spring returned. They calculated every unit of energy in a way we today call nutritional science. A family of 5 needed roughly 360,000 calories to survive the winter. Fat offered 9 calories per gram, grains and legumes gave 6, dried meat gave 4. A single pound of tallow could feed 3 adults through a full day of heavy labor, while that same weight in dried fruit barely counted as a light meal. The most shocking twist is this: the very people we imagine as illiterate, simple, untrained in numbers, actually possessed a level of caloric calculation nearly identical to a modern nutrition expert. They didn't trust luck, they trusted numbers, ratios, and a practical understanding of the human body and how it burns energy in the cold. And it was that clarity, not brute strength, that carried them through hundreds of winters. If these calorie engineers of the Middle Ages surprised you, share your thoughts. Do you think modern people have lost the survival math our ancestors once saw as basic knowledge? If you only look at the numbers, each person giving off about 100 watts of heat, each cow producing 1,500 to 2,000.
It's been a long day.
You might think this is
I'm
just a
glad to
simple
finally be home.
thermodynamics equation, but a winter night inside a medieval home was something entirely different. It was the moment when an entire family, people and animals alike, quietly connected into one single living organism, built to withstand the cold knocking at the door. As the fire in the hearth faded, every breath turned into thin trails of mist drifting through the dark. A child startled by the wind whistling through the wooden walls would crawl closer between their parents.
I have to go now.
The
but I will
slow,
be
heavy
back.
breaths of the cows in the adjoining stall sent a quiet stream of warmth seeping through the cracks. And under the thick layer of straw, the earthy, warm scent of dried grass mixed with human warmth into a smell anyone who has lived through a rural winter never forgets. Modern people might see all of this as rough or primitive, but for them,
Here is
it was
some fresh
optimal
water
heating
for you.
strategy. Sleeping together to create a shared microclimate, raising the beds to escape the cold air drifting along the floor, keeping livestock under the same roof to capture every bit of heat their bodies could give. In our time, the idea of togetherness is often seen as cramped and lacking privacy. But for medieval people, it was the line between life and death. What many modern people overlook when talking about warmth inside a medieval home is the quiet but decisive role of the bed, the floor, and the layer of dry straw. Things that look simple but actually worked as a far more sophisticated insulation system than they appear. Because in a world without central heating, where winter ground was so cold it could drain heat from a human body in minutes, medieval people understood that survival began with getting themselves as far away from the earth as possible. They didn't sleep right on the floor as many imagine. Their beds were raised 2 to 3 feet, just high enough to escape the cold air that pooled along the ground like an invisible blanket. Beneath them was a thick layer of dry straw and packed grass forming a giant insulating mattress. And the mattress itself was stuffed with freshly cut straw, each hollow stem trapping tiny pockets of air that worked exactly like the structure of modern insulation material. When the family climbed into bed, the straw crackled softly, body heat seeped into every layer, and within minutes the bed turned into its own warm chamber, far hotter than the rest of the room. We tend to think warmth comes from the fireplace, but for medieval people, the warmest place in the house was the bed they stuffed with their own hands, a piece of ingenuity that made up for everything their era lacked. On winter nights so cold the wind sounded like someone whispering through the cracks in the walls. There was one technique medieval people treated as an heirloom secret, a ritual half science, half sorcery that turned lifeless stones into burning hearts, capable of keeping an entire household warm until dawn. What made this technique feel almost legendary wasn't its complexity, but the patience and understanding it required, something modern people rarely still possess. They didn't choose stones by guesswork, but by an instinct rooted in ancient metallurgy. Soapstone for its unmatched heat retention, granite for its durability and stability, and they avoided sandstone entirely because it could explode when exposed to high temperatures. When the hearth fire burned at its fiercest, the deep amber glow that made the whole house seem to breathe, the stones were placed directly into the bed of red coals, slowly shifting from cold gray to a soft, living red. After 2 or 3 hours at 800 to 1000 degrees, they held an enormous reservoir of heat that only someone who has handled them with an iron hook could fully understand. But the next step was the part no one forgot. Skilled hands wrapped the blazing stone in multiple layers of thick wool, each layer tightened as if sealing a spirit inside. And once the wrapping was done, the stone no longer scorched, it became a gentle, steady, enduring source of warmth. They set it at the foot of the bed to warm their feet, tucked it between two people to protect their core, or placed it under the blankets where children slept to ensure the heat didn't die before morning. Perhaps that's why many European regions once believed stones can hold fire the way ancestors hold the soul of the family. It's hard to say whether they were superstitious or simply understood nature far better than we do. If you've ever tried this technique or seen someone use hot stones to survive the cold, share your story. Your experience might unlock yet another layer of the old secrets our ancestors once guarded. Of all the survival secrets the medieval world left behind, none is more astonishing than their ability to keep a living flame alive through an entire night, even an entire day, without adding a single extra stick of wood. What looks like magic was actually a delicate art called banking the fire, something a modern person seeing it for the first time might mistake for extinguishing the hearth. But for medieval families, this was one of the most critical moments of the entire day. When the fire had burned down to tightly packed red embers, they gathered them into a small mound no larger than 2 cupped hands, then covered it with a fine layer of ash exactly 2 to 3 inches thick, no more, no less, because even the slightest deviation would either smother the fire completely or make it flare up and consume the remaining wood. Under that blanket of ash, the embers didn't burn. They smoldered like a sleeping heart of fire, holding at 400-500 degrees for 12 to 24 hours. In the morning, they simply brushed the ash aside to reveal thin red streaks glowing like cat's eyes in the dark, placed a bundle of dry kindling on top, and blew gently, one long, slow breath. Within seconds, the flame sprang back to life as if it had never disappeared at all. The most shocking part is this. Modern homes turn on and off at the press of a button, yet medieval homes survived entire winters powered by what looked like a useless pile of ash. And maybe that forces us to ask ourselves, is what we call convenience really stronger than understanding? While we tend to think of winter clothing as something you simply wear to feel less cold, medieval people saw every layer on their bodies as a mobile survival architecture calculated and engineered just as carefully as a roof or a hearth. What made their system almost artistic was the way they combined natural materials in the exact order the body needed them. Against the skin was always a thin layer of linen, a fabric most people associate with summer, yet it pulled moisture away from the skin before it could drain the body's heat. Over that came multiple layers of wool, each layer trapping a thin pocket of air, creating warm air chambers similar to double-insulated walls. And wrapping it all was a thick wool cloak that had been fulled, with traces of natural lanolin left in the fibers, turning it into a shield against wind and water. Even the hands and feet weren't neglected. Wool socks stuffed into grease-treated leather shoes, mitten-style gloves that let the fingers share heat, and a hood pulled tight over the head to prevent the 7–10% of body heat normally lost from the scalp. And the biggest twist is this. When researchers recreated this outfit and tested it in 4 degrees Fahrenheit conditions, it performed almost on par with modern technical gear worth hundreds of dollars. It turns out survival never depended on how thick the clothing was, but on knowing exactly what the body needs to create and keep its own heat. On nights when the temperature dropped to 13 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind hissed through the gaps in the walls like someone whistling in the dark, there was one decision many medieval families had to make to stay alive. Not adding more firewood, not feeding the flames harder, but stepping outside into skin-cutting cold to pack snow against the walls of their own house. It looked like the desperate act of someone on the verge of freezing to death, yet it was one of the strongest insulation strategies their ancestors ever used. The father held a shovel, his breath pouring out in thick white clouds. The mother clutched her wool cloak, stiffened by frost. The child shivered on the doorstep, watching them press the first layer of snow, each crunch echoing through the night like ice cracking. And slowly, 2 to 3 feet of packed snow built up against the wind-facing wall, forming a winter armor that modern people would almost certainly call insane. But the twist is right here. The thing you think makes you cold is what keeps you alive. Because 90–95% of snow's volume is air, and when packed correctly, it creates an insulation layer of R1821, the same as a modern exterior wall. Some homes, once their entire north side was covered in snow, reduced heat loss by as much as 40%, allowing the family to save nearly half their firewood for the whole winter. It's ironic that modern society treats snow as winter's enemy, while medieval people saw it as their most important ally. If this detail surprised you, leave a comment. Would you dare try the snow banking technique if you were caught in a blackout during a brutal winter? There is one thing you only understand after spending a truly cold night inside a medieval house. Silence is never a sign of peace. It's the spine-chilling warning that something is about to happen. Because in the dead of winter, when the wind whistles through the door, cracks like someone quietly calling your name in the dark, when each tiny snap inside the stone wall sounds like the footsteps of a stranger walking above the ceiling, and when the thick wool curtain suddenly stirs in the faint firelight, there is only one thing that makes the whole family freeze in place: absolute silence. Medieval people knew well that when the wind stopped howling, when the walls stopped trembling, when every sound disappeared, that was the moment the temperature was dropping the fastest, and the room was being surrounded by cold like a hunting animal closing in step by step. That's why even a single noise, just a dry log popping, was enough to make the entire household sit up. The firekeeper rushed to the hearth to check the embers. The mother pulled the wool blanket up to her chin, and the father shut the door tighter where the wind had just tried to sneak in. A winter night in a medieval home wasn't a time for peaceful sleep. It was a silent battle between humans and 2 invisible enemies: wind and silence. What's remarkable is this. Modern people treat those sounds as annoyances, but medieval families treated them as survival signals. And perhaps this sensitivity, the ability to listen to the house like a living creature, is exactly what we've lost in the age of double-paned windows and electric heating. If you've ever spent a night where sound or the lack of it made you feel the cold closing in, share your story in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering the survival secrets buried beneath ancient winters, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.